Hello, students. Lesson 3 in our examination of the challenges and problems facing the United States in the late 19th century focuses us on the rise of organized labor in America. All of the challenges and changes that we've been examining thus far, to some degree or another, take root in the Industrial Revolution, but none probably more so than the beginnings of the labor unions in the United States. Labor unions developed in response to the industrial working conditions and the unchecked capitalism of the American economy. The conditions that people worked under in the factories, the sweatshops seen in this photograph here, the mines, and other places were somewhat less than desirable, let's say. The average work day was 12 hours, and a work week was usually about 6 days a week. Although in some areas like mining, you could work 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. Owners strictly regulated your day, particularly in the factories where everybody was operating on machines that all worked at the same pace. So when you could go to the bathroom, when you could eat, how much time you had to do so. If you fell behind or broke any of the rules of the shop, which could include things like hair length or clothing and so on and so forth, you would be fined. And many workers often found themselves taking home very little pay because the owners maybe made some unscrupulous use of this system to fine most of the pay out of the workers' hands and back into their own. Shops and mines and factories were poorly lit and poorly ventilated. They were overheated. They were noisy. Some workers had hearing loss from this. They were unsafe. There was no safety regulations. There were no laws that required safety in the factories. There were usually no covers on the machines, and it was pretty easy for somebody to get a hand caught in there or an article of clothing caught in there and become grievously injured by this. Now, this is also a time period before what we would call the social safety net. There's no welfare, there's no unemployment insurance, there's no disability, no social security, none of that. So if you are injured and you are no longer able to do your job, say you lose a limb in the factory because it's poorly lit and unsafe, the boss will just fire you and replace you with somebody else. And you have no income. We had not yet decided that as a society we would take care of our disabled people. So you were out on your own. Another problem in the industrial workplace was the growing commonality of child labor. As you can see from this photograph here, we had some very young children working in some very unsafe factory conditions. And this was becoming much, much more common. It started out because the wages of factory workers had gotten to the point where you needed two incomes in order to support a family. So both parents had to go to work. Now, if you have kids, you have to figure out what to do with them. So rather than let them run the streets, many parents started bringing their kids to the factories with them. The owners and bosses in the factories would then start putting the kids to work, first doing odd jobs and eventually running machines like these boys are doing here. Now, this worked out pretty well for the owners because you could pay kids less because they weren't the main breadwinner of the family. For the families, it was a little bit more of an income, but it had the effect of suppressing wages overall so that wages stayed low for everybody so that you almost had to put your kids to work. By the 1890s, 20% of all kids between the ages of 10 and 16 in America were working in a factory or a mine. And this was not good. Studies showed that it was stunting on both their mental and physical development. Another problem that many workers faced was living in a company town. Now, this was most often a problem for miners, but there were some factories that also built company towns. And in this, the company that owns the mine or the factory builds a town around the mine or factory, and all of the workers live there. So you're paying rent to the company, you are buying from the company's store, and the company controls your wages, they control your rent, and they control the prices that you pay. So bosses would oftentimes keep your wages just high enough to cover your expenses and nothing more, or sometimes to run you into debt. And this is a problem that workers referred to as wage slavery. Wage slavery came because it was illegal for you to skip out on your debts. If you tried to leave town and quit before you had paid back what you owed to the company store, they could have you arrested. So you were kind of stuck in that situation, and the bosses controlled all your access to your necessities. Now, if this reminds you of sharecropping, it probably should. Remember, in the sharecropping situation, the farm workers didn't own the land they were on, and they oftentimes owed great debts to the landowners and had to buy all of their provisions from a store that was owned by the landowner. Now, this was a common connection between the two, but the owners will try to keep divisions up between them and between workers. Company towns were oftentimes segregated as a way of further dividing the workforce by race and ethnicity and preventing them from more effectively working together. Labor unions were organized to address the problems of the workplace, and they operated through something called collective bargaining, which basically means negotiating as a group. If you as an individual worker or a couple of workers complained about the unsafe work conditions or low wages, the bosses would just fire you and replace you with somebody else. But if you came as a group with the same demands, you might be able to get them to listen. And one of the surest ways that they could get them to listen was the use of the strike. Now, in a strike, all the union members refuse to work until the owners meet their demands, or more often in this case, at least acknowledge their right to be a union and to negotiate with them. Now, if you think about the system, the way it works, the only thing the worker has is his or her time and labor. All of the means of production is in the hands of the owners, the machines, the factories, and the product that comes out at the end. So the worker is withholding his part of production in order to get better conditions under which to work. Many of the union organizers were influenced by a political ideology and economic ideology that was growing in Europe at the time, socialism. Socialism, simply put, believes that society at large should control the nation's wealth, not individuals, that all people are participating in the growth in the economy, and all people should get a share of that. Obviously, the owners and the bosses did not like socialism and did not like unions, primarily because they were a threat to the wealth that they had accumulated, oftentimes at the expense of the workers. But also, many factory owners and mine owners would argue that unions were a violation of their property rights because they were telling them, in part, how to use their property, how to use their factories in which those workers operated. Labor unions will develop in nearly all industries in the United States. And the late 19th century will also see the development of national labor unions, organizations of workers across the country. One of the most inclusive of these is going to be the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor wanted to organize all workers, skilled and unskilled, regardless of race or gender, into one big union. And through that collective bargaining, they wanted to bring about broad reforms to government and society to make things more fair for the workers and the labor class. They would do things like plan manufacturing co-ops where the workers actually owned the means of production. Another big labor union, the one that will actually start to replace the Knights of Labor when they decline, which we'll get to in a moment, was the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL. And this was essentially a union of unions. The various skilled unions, because the AFL only included skilled workers, their unions would be part of this union. The AFL tended to exclude women and people of color, but they also focused more specifically on what was called bread and butter issues, things like work hours, safety, and wages, without any look to broader social changes. One of the first industrial unions was the American Railway Union. An industrial union is one that organizes workers across an entire industry. So the ARU included not just the people who operated the trains, but the people who built the cars and the tracks and so on and so forth, because they were all part of the railway union. The big, broad reform union that will develop later on, after the Knights of Labor decline, is the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, or sometimes called the Wobblies. The Wobblies represented unskilled workers, and they pushed for sort of a worldwide union. They wanted radical political and social changes, much like the Knights of Labor, but even more so. And they will oftentimes be the subject of violent clashes with authority in countries all over the world. As I mentioned before, the biggest weapon in the union's arsenal is going to be the strike. And there will be many, many strikes in the late 19th, early 20th century, primarily focusing on wages, hours, and working conditions. We're going to just focus on 4 key strikes from this time period. The first is the 1877 Great Railroad Strike. Railroad workers will strike because of a wage cut. This is a common reason we'll see for many unions going on strike. They will destroy property and bring the railroads pretty much to a halt in the United States. State militias are called out to break up the strike, and eventually U.S. troops will join them. And this is another common thing that you'll see, is the response from the government is oftentimes to side with the business and try to break up the strikes. Depicted here is the 1886 Haymarket Riot, or the Haymarket Bombing, or Haymarket Affair, depending on who you ask. And this happens in Haymarket Square in Chicago. Now, the Knights of Labor prior to this had called for a general strike to push for an 8-hour workday. There had been many violent clashes between the police attacking the strikers. And this was a protest that was organized, a rally that was organized in Haymarket Square. Somebody threw a bomb, killing several police officers and bystanders. 8 anarchists were arrested and blamed for it. 4 of them were executed. But the governor of Illinois, looking at the case, said there was very, very little evidence to convict these men of any of it. And he pardoned 3 of them. The last one had actually committed suicide while in jail. This incident, though, really kind of soured the public on the Knights of Labor in particular, and their popularity began to decline as they became associated with violence, riots, and anarchists. In 1892, workers at one of Andrew Carnegie's steel mills in Homestead, Pennsylvania, will strike in response to a scheme to tie their wages to the price of steel. So mass production of steel would continually drive down the price of the product, which would then in turn further dwindle the already low wages of the steel workers. In response to the strike, the Pinkerton Detective Agency was called in, which was essentially a private security firm that saw frequent use by company bosses in breaking up strikes. They clashed violently with workers, leaving several strikers dead, and as the strike drug on, they started to lose popularity in the American press and were forced to call it off. 2 years later, we'll see a major railway industry strike in response to the Pullman Car Company. The Pullman Car Company made luxury passenger cars for railroads, and they owned a company town around the factory. The company attempted to cut workers' wages while at the same time keeping the rent in the homes that they rented to the workers high. When workers brought these concerns to Pullman, he fired them. So in response, Eugene V. Debs, the leader of the ARU, called for a general railroad strike. So anybody who worked on something related to the railroads, whether it was building the cars, operating the trains, or building the tracks, went on strike. Pullman and the railroad companies appealed to the federal government, who used the argument that since the mail travels on the railroads, they could send in U.S. troops and force the workers back to work. Eugene Debs will be arrested, not for the last time, under charges of conspiring against interstate commerce. The graphic organizer for this lesson is organized right along the same route as the outline. The top part, 5 reasons unions were formed. Give me 5 problems that workers faced. In the second part, describe each of the 4 major labor unions listed there and define the tactics: collective bargaining, strike, and socialism. And at the bottom part, for each of the 4 major strikes, tell me why it occurred and what was the outcome. As an example, I filled in the Great Railroad Strike, where we see workers' wages cut, and the results listed there. Till next time, te amo, adios.